I did my PhD research on Crater Lake in Oregon, so I want to start a series on Crater Lake secrets, or at least lesser-known facts. To lay the groundwork, I'm beginning with the fact that Crater Lake isn't actually a crater. A volcanic crater forms at the initial explosion site when an eruption occurs and the rock gets blasted outwards. A caldera, on the other hand, is when the mountain collapses in on itself. Before it was a caldera, Crater Lake was Mount Mazama, a 12,000-foot tall volcano similar to others in the Cascade Range. Around 7,700 years ago, a large eruption started with a single vent near the summit of the mountain. This single vent eruption removed so much material from the magma chamber below that the roof of it couldn't support the weight of the mountain above. As Mount Mazama collapsed inward, multiple vents opened up in a ring circling the summit of the mountain. This sent huge pyroclastic flows out in all directions that reached up to 75 kilometers away. You can think of it like a pot with a lid when it starts boiling over, and what would happen if you shoved something down into that water at the same time. Within hours, over a mile of mountain had disappeared, leaving behind a caldera that was gradually filled up with snowmelt and rainwater. Of course, that's not to say there are no craters at Crater Lake. Several post-caldera eruptions have occurred, one of which formed Wizard Island on the western side of the lake. This island does have a small crater at its summit and is a great vantage point for checking out the walls of the caldera. This is a great question, and it actually makes a lot of sense that the ancient volcano was given a name because indigenous peoples have lived in the area for about 10,000 years. They would have actually witnessed the caldera-forming eruption as well as ones that came before and after it. The name Mazama, however, comes from the name of a hiking group that one of the founders of Crater Lake National Park, William G. Steele, was a member of, called the Mazamas. The word Mazama is an obsolete word for mountain goat, although it's actually derived from an Aztec word for a small deer native to Central and South America. The Native American name for Mount Mazama was Moyaina or Lauyaina, and they call the lake Jiwas. There's an incredible oral history that exists about the volcano and the caldera-forming eruption. One of these stories says that the mountain was the entrance to the below world and the home of its chief, Lau. It tells of a great battle between Lau and Skell, the chief of the above world, who came down on top of Mount Shasta, another Cascade volcano, to defend the tribes in the area from Lau's wrath. The two gods threw rock and fire at one another, but Lau was defeated and cast back down into the mountain, which collapsed around him. To this day, the lake remains sacred to native peoples, some of whom refuse to look upon the water, believing that it could lead to their death. Yeah, okay, this one is definitely not in any of the standard guidebooks. On the southwest corner of the Crater Lake Lodge parking lot is a boulder. To most people, it might not seem like anything special, but it's an important piece of evidence of just how powerful the caldera-forming eruption was. It's a piece of granodiorite and is what we call an intrusive igneous rock. Basically, it crystallized beneath Earth's surface rather than at the surface like the extrusive rocks that would have formed during the eruption. So the question was, why is it sitting here and not underground? The answer is that Mount Mazama's big eruption did such a good job of emptying out the magma chamber that pieces of the walls were actually being torn up and brought to the surface. The chemistry and ages of these blocks correspond to earlier eruptions of Mount Mazama. This means that they were older batches of magma that had solidified beneath the surface. So if you want to get a glimpse of the magma chamber walls, go check it out! It's time for more Crater Lake secrets, and this is a really great question. It's a bit counterintuitive, but volcanic eruptions where magma interacts with shallow groundwater or surface water are actually even more explosive. This makes the presence of a lake a major hazard for future eruptions at Crater Lake. We call these hydrovolcanic eruptions, and if you look at a comparison of explosiveness of volcanoes, you can see that even the smaller ones are highly explosive relative to their size. The reason for this is that as the water makes contact with molten rock, it instantly flashes to steam and expands, causing a violent explosion. Good examples of what this might look like include the eruption of Surtsey in Iceland, seen here, this eruption from 2009 off the coast of Tonga, and this one from just a few days ago at Taal Volcano in the Philippines. Yes, but first I want to talk about the lake itself, which is pretty amazing on its own. Crater Lake is the deepest lake in the US and the second deepest lake in North America. The average depth is about 1,148 feet and the maximum depth is 1,949 feet. In fact, if you were to stack the Eiffel Tower, the Washington Monument, and the Statue of Liberty on top of one another, there would still be about 100 feet of water over Lady Liberty's torch. That makes the depth of the caldera, which measures about 8 by 10 kilometers across, as a whole all the more impressive when you consider that the walls of it above the waterline add an additional 1,000 to 2,000 feet for a total depth of over 1 kilometer. You can swim in the lake, but since it's at high elevation and mainly filled by snowmelt and rainwater, it is pretty chilly. There are no inlets, meaning no sediment or mineral deposits are carried in. This makes it one of the cleanest and clearest lakes in the world and gives it its vibrant blue color. The volcano is considered active, meaning it's had an eruption within the last 10,000 years and will erupt again someday. We have evidence of magmatic activity continuing to happen beneath the surface, like these hydrothermal vents that were found at the bottom of the lake. These were observed using a one-man submersible called Deep Rover in 1988 to 1989. There's also an old hemlock log called the Old Man of the Lake that floats upright and has been bobbing around it for at least the last 100 years. The tree itself has been carbon dated to be about 450 years old and is buoyant enough that park rangers used to stand on it during boat tours. Time for more Crater Lake. Crater Lake is home to a special little amphibian called the Mazama newt, or sometimes also called the Crater Lake newt. They are only found on the shores of this mountaintop lake, and scientists think they diverged from their cousins outside the caldera when a few rough-skinned newts, which can be found in other areas of the park, wandered over the rim and into the lake during a particularly wet period up to 6,000 years ago. Since then, the Mazama newt developed into its own distinct subspecies. Newts are one of only a few land animals that produce tetrodotoxin, a potent neurotoxin that acts as a defense against predators. It's the same toxin that's found in the pufferfish and blue-ringed octopus. Because the Mazama newts have no natural predators, they started producing less and less of it to save energy and now have 4,000 times less tetrodotoxin relative to the newts outside the caldera. However, that's now put them in danger. Non-native crayfish were introduced to the lake in the early part of the 20th century as food for the non-native fish that were also introduced to attract fishermen. Between competition for food and real estate and predation by the crayfish, the Mazama newt is now being pushed towards extinction, and scientists haven't been able to stop the growing crayfish population. You can see in this graphic that in just 6 years, between 2008 and 2014, the parts of the lakeshore occupied by the Mazama newt shrank drastically compared to those occupied by the non-native crayfish. Just another lesson in why we shouldn't introduce things to ecosystems that don't belong there in the first place. Let's talk about the ghost ship of Crater Lake. On the southeastern side of the lake is a tiny island. On foggy mornings, in dim light, or in poor weather, it looks like a ghostly pirate ship and can even fade in and out of view, which is why it's called the Phantom Ship. There's more to this little island than meets the eye, though. It's actually bigger than you'd expect, at about 500 feet long and 170 feet high. This island is a remnant of some of the earliest rocks that erupted in the area that were eventually engulfed by Mount Mazama as it grew. It's made up of a type of volcanic rock called andesite and is about 400,000 years old. Before the caldera-forming eruption, this rock would have been buried under over a mile of mountain, so the fact that we can now observe and analyze it is one of the reasons that makes Crater Lake so special. It also has a remarkable level of biodiversity for such a small island. It has 6 species of trees and 32 species of ground plants. So let's show some love to Crater Lake's spookiest little island. Crater Lake is the deepest lake in the United States. Scientists have made multiple dives into various portions of the lake. Here are some of the strange and fantastic things they observed. The journey to the bottom in the Deep Rover submersible took up to 30 minutes. Images from these dives include these small craters in the deepest portions of the lake. It's speculated they could be from the release of fluids or gases or from biological activity. They also observed 30-foot-tall spires created by past hydrothermal vent activity, thick yellow-orange mats of bacteria colonies thriving on hydrothermal fluids, and even in the deepest basin in the lake, they observed various invertebrates living there. Scuba divers have also visited the shallower portions of the lake to photograph and sample thick deposits of dead aquatic moss that have strange tunnels and pits through them. The dead moss deposits are up to 120 feet thick, and the mechanism for creating these tunnels is unknown. These features can range in size from a few inches to tens of yards in diameter. The live moss that they originate from is present all around the edge of the lake and Wizard Island. Additionally, a helicopter from a 1995 crash along with its pilot and passenger remain at the bottom of the lake under around 1,500 feet of water. The reason for the crash is unknown, as witnesses reported seeing the helicopter flying low over the lake, but it seemed to be under no distress before suddenly colliding with the water. And of course, you should always keep an eye out for this guy. Stories of mysterious disappearances, fantastic creatures of legend, and ghostly sightings are often told about many national parks, and Crater Lake is no exception. The Klamath tribe has been telling these stories for thousands of years. To them, the lake is a sacred place, and the spirit of Lau, the chief of the below world, still resides there. It's said that when he is angered, he can take the form of a giant crayfish and drag people down to the depths. Remember those huge mysterious tunnels in the dead moss I talked about in part 9? Well, people have claimed to see a giant creature in the lake. A woman named Maddie Hatcher was out in a rowboat with friends in 2002 and says she saw a creature that looked like a dragon the size of a city block swim beneath the boat. Of course, rowboats haven't been allowed on the lake since before her story took place, so we'll take this one with a grain of salt. Wizard Island is the center of many stories. Rangers tell tales of seeing campfires on the island, only to find out that nothing is there when they arrive by boat to check it out. Another ghostly fire was spotted outside the rim. Ranger Kerwin claimed she saw 10 people around a roaring campfire far from the designated campground. As soon as she approached to tell them off, the fire and all of the people had disappeared. Supposedly, it was on the site of an old Park Service campground called Cold Spring. The old man of the lake even gets in on the action, as it's claimed that he controls the weather. When the submarine crew was diving in the lake in the late 1980s to study the bottom, they tried tying him up so he wouldn't get in the way. Legend says that severe storms blew in, stirring up the water and preventing them from working. They stopped as soon as he was set free. If you're interested in more, you can find stories of crime and mishaps in the news archives maintained by the Crater Lake Institute. There's also a lot of really cool other stuff on their website about the science and history of the park.